I pulled her cart before the sun for 10 years, before she ever asked me my last name. I told her I didn't have one worth keeping. That was true enough. A king sheds more than a crown when he wants to disappear. He sheds every name that would give him away, every title that would make a stranger's spine straighten when she said it. I had buried mine somewhere on the road north. The same week I buried the last of my patience with a court that wanted a mate chosen from a ledger of noble bloodlines, and a war that had taken more good men from me than I had ever managed to save. Ashwood Vale took me in without asking questions, the way border villages do when a quiet man arrives with strong hands, a decent horse he's willing to sell, and no past he cares to discuss. I split with that first week until my palms split with it. I hauled water for the smith. I mucked stalls for a farmer named Corin who paid in eggs and silence, both of which suited me. And on my fourth morning in the Vale, half frozen and half certain I'd made a mistake leaving a warm hall for a cold border hut, I saw a woman dragging a handcart of wet washing down toward the river alone, wheels catching on every rut, and something in me, not my wolf, not yet, just whatever was left of the man underneath it, could not walk past that. "Let me," I said. She looked at me the way you'd look at a stray dog that had wandered too close to your dinner. "I don't know you." "No," I agreed. "But the cart doesn't care who pulls it." She considered that with a seriousness that told me everything about how she'd survived whatever had put her alone on a riverbank at dawn with a dead husband's linens to wash. Then she stepped back from the handle and let me take it, and that was the whole of our introduction. She didn't offer her name until we reached the river, and even then it came out like a concession rather than a courtesy. "Ilara," she said. "Vance." "Ronan," I said, only that. It was, at the time, the truest thing about me. She looked at my hands on the cart handle, too clean for a laborer's, not yet ruined by real work, the calluses still a season away, and said, "You'll blister by noon." I did badly. She didn't apologize for being right, and she didn't offer salve either, though she left a jar of it on my doorstep the next morning without a word, the way a woman does a kindness she doesn't want thanked for. I understood, even then, that this was simply how Ilara loved people, sideways, through actions she'd deny were affection if you called them that to her face. I pulled that cart every morning after. It became a fact of the village the way the mill wheel was a fact, the way the bell at the chapel was a fact. Ronan pulls the widow Vance's washing to the river. No one remarked on it after the first month. I was grateful for that more than I can say, for a decade of mornings where the most notable thing about me was that I was reliable. Not that I was a king who had once commanded armies and now could not command a woman to let him carry her grief for her. Her son Tobin was 4 then, all elbows and questions, a boy who had inherited his mother's habit of saying true things at the worst possible moments. He decided within a week that I belonged to him the way boys decide a stray dog belongs to them, total ownership, granted without my consent and impossible to refuse. He walked at my heel down to the river most mornings, when Ilara would let him, kicking stones and narrating his own small dramas. "Why do wolves howl at the moon?" he asked me once, no more than a month into knowing me, apropos of nothing, the way children ask the largest questions as though they were the smallest. "Because they're calling to something they've lost," I told him. It was truer than he knew. "Have you ever lost anything?" "Yes." He waited for me to say more. I didn't. He let it be, the way children do when the answer isn't really the point. The asking was. I taught him to skip stones that spring, badly at first, and then, by the time he was 6, better than I could. I taught him to track deer through the low woods east of the Vale the winter he turned 8, showing him how to read a broken branch, a disturbed patch of frost, the particular way a startled animal's hoof prints deepen at the toe. I never told him why I knew these things so well, that a king who has hunted for sport his whole life learns the forest the way other men learn their own front rooms. I let him believe I was simply a careful man who paid attention, which was also true, just not the whole of it. He asked me once, the winter he was 9, whether I had ever been afraid. Every day, I told him. You don't look it. That's most of what being grown means, Tobin. Learning to carry the fear where no one else has to look at it. He turned that over the way he turned over most things I told him, slowly, seriously, filing it away for later use. He would remember it. Boys like Tobin remember everything a man says to them when they are deciding, quietly and without announcing it, what kind of man they mean to become. My wolf never told me what I was doing there. 10 years is a long silence for a thing that usually will not shut up, that paces and growls, and makes its wants known in 100 small betrayals of expression and posture. Mine went quiet the day I arrived in Ashwood Vale, and did not properly speak again for the better part of a decade. But it never once bristled at her. Never bared teeth, not in 10 years, not when she was tired and sharp with me over nothing, not when she wept once in the dark of her own kitchen thinking I'd already gone home for the night and I stood outside her door instead of walking away, my hand flat against the wood, not knocking, just near. It only ever went still in her presence. A stillness I mistook, for the better part of those years, for peace. For the particular calm of a man who had finally stopped wanting anything he couldn't have. I told myself I stayed in Ashwood Vale for the boy. That was also true. It was simply not the whole of it, and some quiet, cowardly part of me was grateful the wolf kept its silence, because silence meant I never had to look directly at what staying really cost me, or what it meant that I could not seem to make myself leave. The seasons turned the way seasons do when a man has stopped counting years by the reigns of kings and started counting them by harvests. I watched Tobin grow from a boy who reached my hip to one who reached my shoulder. I watched Ilara's hands go from raw and cracked with a widow's overwork to merely weathered, the particular toughness of a woman who has decided, somewhere along the way, that she will survive whatever comes because the alternative isn't available to her. She was not an easy woman to know. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters to what came after. She was not soft, not warm in the way stories like to make their heroines warm. She was sharp-tongued when she was frightened, which was often, though she'd never have named it that. She kept her grief for her husband locked somewhere I never saw the door to, and she did not thank me, most days, for the water I hauled or the wood I split or the cart I pulled, because thanks required acknowledging a debt, and Ilara Vance did not like owing anyone anything, least of all a stranger who had wandered into her village with no past and no name worth keeping. I loved her for all of it. I want to be honest about that too. I did not decide to. It simply accumulated, the way frost accumulates on a window overnight. You do not see it happening, and then one morning the whole pane is white with it, and you cannot remember the glass being clear. There was a night in the 6th year, Tobin 11, sleeping, the two of us sitting on her step because I'd stayed late mending a fence post that hadn't strictly needed mending, when she looked at me for a long moment in the dark and said, "You could have your own house by now, Ronan. Your own land. You've saved enough coin pulling every cart and fixing every fence in this village for anyone twice over." "I like it here," I said. Here meaning the Vale, or here meaning my step. I did not answer that. She did not press it. We sat in the kind of silence that either ends a thing or begins one, and that night it did neither. It only postponed, the way we postponed most things between us, for 4 more years. The fever took her in the 9th winter, and my wolf would not let me leave her door. I want to say I fought it. I want to say there was some noble restraint in me that considered walking home to my own cold hearth and leaving her care to the village women, as a cart hand ought to. There wasn't. Corin's wife came by that first evening with broth and a worried face, and found me already sitting on Ilara's step in the snow, my back against her door, and she looked at me the way the whole village had slowly, wordlessly begun to look at me over the years, like a fact they'd all quietly agreed not to discuss. I sat there through the first night. Through the second, when her fever climbed high enough that I could hear her through the door, restless and murmuring things I made myself not listen to too closely, because a man who has already given up his crown for a woman has no right to also take her privacy in a fever. On the third night, Tobin, 15 now, taller than his mother, solemn in the particular way boys get when their mothers are sick, and they are old enough to understand exactly what that might mean, opened the door and looked down at me sitting in the drifted snow. "You might as well come in," he said. "You're no use to anyone frozen." I went in. I sat by her bed while Tobin slept in the chair by the hearth, exhausted past arguing, and I did what any decent neighbor might do, a hand at her wrist to feel the fever's crest, a cool cloth at her brow, the small mercies that cost nothing and mean everything when a person is too sick to thank you for them. I did not touch her more than that. I want that understood plainly. But somewhere in that room, in the fourth hour of the fourth night, some old part of me that had gone to sleep the day I buried my name opened one eye and did not close it again. The fever broke near dawn on the fourth day. She surfaced from it the way a swimmer surfaces from deep water, gasping, disoriented, blinking against the gray light through the shutters, and found me still there, my hand loosely around her wrist where I'd been counting her pulse slow itself back to normal. "You didn't have to stay," she said. Her voice was wrecked with 4 days of fever, barely a whisper. "I know," I said. She didn't ask why I had. I have wondered in all the years since whether she already knew the answer and was only being kind enough not to make me say it aloud before either of us was ready to hear it. My right hand, that whole week after, ached in a place with no wound in it, a dull, insistent throb along the back of it, under the skin, like an old break remembering weather. I told myself it was the cold. I had told myself a great many things were the cold, over the years, that were not the cold at all. Something shifted after the fever, though neither of us named it. She began leaving the second cup out in the mornings without being asked, the way you do for someone whose presence you've stopped questioning. Tobin, sharper than either of us gave him credit for, took to watching the two of us with a particular quiet attention. Not suspicion, exactly, more like a boy doing sums in his head and arriving, slowly, at an answer he wasn't yet sure he was allowed to say out loud. "You'd make a good father," he told me once, that spring, apropos of nothing, the way he still asked his largest questions as though they were his smallest. We were mending the henhouse roof. He didn't look at me when he said it. "I had a father," I said carefully. "A hard man. I try to be nothing like him." "That's not what I asked." I set down my hammer. "No," I admitted, "it isn't." He nodded, satisfied with that, the way boys are satisfied by honesty even when it isn't quite an answer, and went back to fitting shingles, and neither of us spoke of it again. But I understood from that day that he had given me something, not permission, not exactly. He was not his mother's keeper and knew it. Something closer to an invitation, left open the way you leave a gate open for an animal you're hoping will wander in on its own. I did not walk through it. I want to be honest about my failures as much as anything else. I had a decade of practice at staying near without staying close, at loving from the careful distance of a hired hand, and habits that old do not break simply because a 15-year-old boy leaves a gate open for you. I told myself there would be time. I told myself the crown I'd buried was buried deep enough that it would never need digging up, that Ashwood Vale could simply go on being the whole of my life, water hauled and carts pulled, and a boy grown into a man under my quiet watch, and that this smaller, humbler shape of loving someone might be enough to live inside forever. I was wrong about that, though not in the way I feared. The raiders came out of the north past 3 nights after the frost fully broke in the 10th spring. The kind of men who take border villages because border villages have no one important enough to answer to when they scream, no garrison, no standing patrol, nothing but farmers and washerwomen, and a quiet cart hand who had spent 10 years making very sure no one in Ashwood Vale had cause to look at him twice. I was hauling water when the horn sounded, Corin's boy, stationed on the low ridge as he was most nights that spring, blowing the long note that meant riders and meant them close. I remember setting the buckets down very carefully. I have thought about that moment more than almost any other in the 10 years I'd spent in that village. The careful, deliberate way I set 2 buckets of water on the frozen ground, as though I were laying down something far heavier and far more final than water. I was, in a sense. I was laying down 10 years of being no one. I remember Tobin's face when he came running from the smithy with a half-forged blade still glowing faintly at the edge, and I remember what he saw in mine, because whatever had been sleeping in me for a decade was already surfacing, and a boy who has spent 10 years reading my quiet the way other boys read their father's moods does not miss the moment the quiet breaks. "Ronan," he started. "Get your mother inside," I said. "Bar the door. Whatever you hear, do not open it until I say your name." He looked at me for one long second. I have wondered since exactly what he understood in that second, whether some part of him had always half known there was more to me than a man who pulled carts and mended fences. And then he ran, because he trusted me, because 10 years of trust does not require an explanation in the moment it's called upon. I did not follow him inside. I will not describe in detail what I became in the square that night, except to say that it had been 10 years since I'd allowed myself to be what I truly was, and a decade of restraint does not weaken a thing like that. It only builds pressure behind a door, and when the door finally opens, everything that was ever going to come through it comes through at once. I shed the shape of Ronan, the cart hand, the way I'd once shed my crown, without ceremony, because there was no time for ceremony, only for what the moment demanded. Ashwood Vale had never seen wolves answer to anyone the way mine answered to me that night. They came down off the northern ridge like something the mountain itself had been keeping in reserve for a decade, waiting on my call the way a held breath waits on release. Not the ordinary wolves of the low woods that Tobin and I had tracked together over the years, but mine, the pack bond I had carried silent and folded away since the day I arrived, snapping back open all at once like a rope pulled taut. The raiders had come for an easy village. They found something else entirely. I will say only this of the fighting. It was fast, and it was final, and no one in Ashwood Vale who had spent 10 years believing me to be nothing more than a careful, quiet man was spared the sight of exactly how untrue that had been. By the time the retreat horn sounded from whatever remained of the raiding party fleeing back toward the pass, the square was full of villagers who had come out of their homes despite every instruction to bar their doors, because fear does that to people, makes them need to see with their own eyes rather than trust what they're told through a wall. I was standing in the middle of it, breathing hard, in a shape no cart hand has ever worn when I saw her. Ilara stood 10 feet away with her hand pressed flat over her mouth, Tobin half a step behind her shoulder, his half-forged blade still clutched forgotten in one fist. She was not looking at the wolves settling, one by one, into a wide ring around me. She was looking at me. At my face, which had not changed, and at everything else about me, which had. My wolves knelt, every one of them, muzzles low to the churned dirt, in front of the whole shaking village, a gesture I had not seen given to me in 10 years, and one I had, in some buried corner of myself, stopped believing I still deserved. I had not knelt to anyone in a decade. I knelt then, in the mud and the aftermath, to her, because it was the only true thing left to do, because 10 years of small mornings and unspoken devotion had earned her at least that much honesty, kneeling instead of standing over her the way a king stands over everyone else in his life without meaning to. The mark I had not seen since I was a young man, since before the war, since before I buried every name that would give me away, burned awake on the back of my right hand, the same hand that had ached without a wound in it through 4 nights of her fever, the same hand that had pulled her cart for 10 years. And across the square, where she'd pressed her own hand flat over her mouth in shock, A thin gold line answered it like a struck match catching flame. "You," she said. Not a question. I watched 10 years of small mornings rearrange themselves behind her eyes in the space of that single word. Every cup of water, every mended fence, every night I'd sat too long on her step and left too late, all of it resolving into a shape she was only now allowed to see whole. "I should have told you," I said. My voice did not sound like Ronan's, not entirely, not anymore. Every day for 10 years I meant to. And every day I decided I liked being nobody to you more than I liked the truth of what I am. I'm sorry for that. I am not sorry for the 10 years. She looked down at the gold mark on the back of her own hand for a long moment, turning it in the torchlight the way a woman turns something over trying to decide if it's real. And then she looked at Tobin, who had gone very still and very old-looking in the space of one raid. Old in the particular way that only happens to children who watch the ground shift under everyone they love all at once. And then, finally, she looked back at me. "You carried my water for 10 years, she said. "You taught my son to track deer and skip stones, and you never once let him see you afraid, even when I know now you must have been. You sat outside my door in the snow 4 nights running and never once used it to ask for anything." She paused. "I don't much care what they call you at whatever court you came from. I'd like to know what you'd like me to call you now." "Ronan," I said, and meant it more fully than I had ever meant it in 10 years of saying it. "Only ever Ronan to you. The rest of it, the crown, the title, whatever they'll want to call me once word travels, I'll wear because I have to. That part of it I'll only carry into your life if you want it there. You don't have to say yes to a king tonight, Alara. I'm not asking you to." She crossed the 10 feet between us the way she crossed everything else in her life, without ceremony, without waiting for anyone's permission but her own, and took the marked hand in both of hers, turning it over once as though she needed to hold the proof of it before she could trust the rest. "Ronan then," she said. "Same as always, I didn't fall in love with a crown, and I'm not about to start being impressed by one now." Behind her, I saw Tobin's shoulders drop half an inch, the particular release of a boy who has been carrying a question for years without knowing its shape, finally set down. He did not smile, not yet. That would come later, over the following days, once the shock had worn thin enough to let something warmer through. But he nodded once to me, man to man across his mother's shoulder. And in that nod was 10 years of hen houses mended and deer tracked and stones skipped, and every quiet, unspoken thing a boy learns from a man who never once told him what he truly was and loved him steadily anyway. The days that followed were not simple. I will not pretend they were. Word travels fast when a border village is defended by an alpha king's own pack, and within a fortnight riders came from the capital, my council, gray and stern, and full of a decade's worth of questions about where their king had disappeared to, and what precisely he intended to do about a throne that had sat empty, and a war that had needed ending without him. I answered those questions. I am, whatever else I have become, still a king, and a king does not get to set down every responsibility simply because he has finally set down the loneliest one. But I answered them from Ashwood Vale, at Alara's kitchen table more often than not, with Tobin listening from the doorway pretending not to and Alara herself refusing flatly to be sent to some grand estate before she was good and ready to go. "I've buried one husband already," she told my council's chief steward, a man who had clearly never been spoken to in that tone by anyone below the rank of duke. "I'll come to your capital when I've finished deciding I actually want to and not one day before. Ronan can wait for me. He's had 10 years of practice." I told her so and meant it, and did not mind the waiting nearly as much as I once might have, because for the first time in a decade I was waiting with a name that was entirely my own, beside a woman who had chosen it, chosen Ronan, the cart hand, the quiet man who hauled her water, over every grander thing I could have offered her instead. We were married in Ashwood Vale in the autumn, not the capital, in the square where my wolves had once knelt, with Corin's whole family in attendance and half the village crowded in besides, because they had, in their own way, earned the right to see how the story they'd half-guessed at for 10 years finally ended. Tobin stood beside me rather than beside his mother, which surprised no one who had watched the two of us over the years, and when I turned to face Alara at the end of it, her hand already marked gold and steady in mine, I thought of the first morning on the riverbank, of a woman who had looked at my 2 clean hands and told me plainly that I would blister by noon. She had never once apologized for being right in 10 years about anything. She did not apologize that day either. She only smiled, small and real and entirely hers, and said, quiet enough that only I could hear it over the crowd, same as always, Ronan. Just mine now too. I have worn a crown since I was young enough that I do not remember the weight of not wearing one. I have been given titles, armies, treaties, the loyalty of a kingdom that never once asked whether I wanted any of it. I have never, in all those years, been given anything the way Alara Vance gave me that morning by the river, and again in the square 10 years later, my own name, small and plain and entirely chosen, handed back to me like it still fit. It always had.